Alright, hello everyone. Welcome to the Economic Society's last and most awaited event of the year. My name is Subhan Arafat and I'm the president of the Coventry Economic Society. So today we have with us Mr. Martin Wolf.
Alright, hello everyone. Welcome to the Economic Society's last and
just a mere disruption there, sorry about that. So yeah, we have with us Mr. Martin Wolf, who is the Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times and also the Associate Editor at the same. They've been writing for the Financial Times for over 20 years now and is massively renowned around the world for his amazing insights into economic matters and what so. So today we are going to have a moderate discussion, just around 40 minutes, that will last with a few questions. Then we will have a 15-minute Q&A session at the end with the audience. So I hope you'll do what you can in welcoming Mr. Martin Wolf today and hopefully get started with our first question. So recently we've had a lot of developments around the NATO and the global war and the war in Ukraine. And it's been almost 2 months since Russia invaded Ukraine, and we've had a constant flows of military aid in Ukraine ever since. Sanctions have been imposed on Russia oligarchs, and just today the UK imposed sanctions on Russians caviar and diamond. So you recently wrote an article that advocated for Russia's gas and imports to be imports to be added to the list too. So with the cost of living that we are already in and Europe's high reliance on Russia's gas, how feasible of a move do you think that would be, and what are the implications of imposing bans on Russian gas in the short term?
I think that's a very good question. Let's go back to the first part of your comment, or the comment that preceded your question. We have, as you said, imposed a lot of sanctions on Russia. And the aim, of course, is to change its behavior. I wrote a previous column which discussed the likely effectiveness of those sanctions. And I argued that they were unlikely to achieve the aim of really altering Russian policy. The record with sanctions is, on the whole, though it's complicated, rather disappointing. And the sorts of sanctions we're using in this current context, in my view, are likely to be quite ineffective. They will not prevent Putin's Russia, from continuing with the war for a very long time if they wish to do so. So the obvious question then is, are there things we can do if our aim is to stop the war that would be more effective than what we've done so far? And the argument I made on oil and gas, above all gas, is that's pretty well the only thing we can do that is likely to be significantly more effective. And the reason for that is, as things stand at the moment, yes, we have imposed massive financial sanctions, but the Russian economy is in a position to survive those for quite a long time. And one of the main reasons for that, of course, is that as a consequence of the war, the prices of oil and gas have risen substantially. So Russia's exports have improved in value terms enormously, and that allows it to continue to buy imports from across the world. And there are no global sanctions on its imports. So we have to cut its exports. And the only exports we're likely to be able to cut are oil and gas. Now, in terms in these terms, oil is pretty well impossible to stop unless we get the entire world's agreement, because it's very easily tradable. It's not that easily tradable. Russia wouldn't find it technically that easy, but it could probably continue to export a lot of oil, even if there were an embargo in Europe and America, which has already imposed one. America doesn't import that much oil anyway. But gas is different. The gas contracts link Russia to Europe. So we are in this paradoxical situation, as you said, that the thing we can do that would hurt Russia most obviously, is also something that would hurt us a lot. Above all, it would hurt certain big countries in Europe, much less the UK, namely Germany and Italy. The prices would rise further. There's no doubt about it. There would probably have to be rationing, and at least for industry. And there would certainly have to be very substantial compensation for poorer people to ensure that they could continue to buy the fuel they need. Fortunately, however, we're moving into summer, so heating becomes less of a problem for quite a long time. We can start investing massively in alternative sources of gas. It would have to be a real emergency program. And the evidence we have from economists who've looked at this is that the hit to the economy as a whole, as opposed to, as I said, the specific problems for certain parts of our communities, would actually be quite modest and could be managed, I think, reasonably satisfactorily. So yes, if we wish to have sanctions that are really effective in this situation, we have to do some things that are really quite painful. And that would have to start, I think, with a gas embargo into Europe.
But if you look at the effects that we are having at the moment, does this magnify the bad effects of globalization? That after all, globalization is actually coming back to bite at us. And you also advocated that we would be having a remake of the world. Is that something that still holds there, or do you think that we also want to be ever dependent on globalization in the near future and long term?
Well, the vulnerability to imports of energy for Europe has now existed for a very, very long time. We started importing oil from the Middle East well over 100 years ago, and it because it became a more effective fuel than coal, really quite a long time ago, and it was indeed for that reason that the West has preserved very close relations with the main Middle Eastern oil suppliers, and that goes back to the Second World War, actually even before that. So this is at least this dependency on imports of raw materials, essential raw materials, and the same is also true of food and foodstuffs, goes back to the early 20th century or even to the 19th century. It's changed over time. I don't have time to go into this. So I don't see that as an indication of the vulnerability created by modern globalization. It's simply an indication of the fact that as countries industrialized and achieved much denser populations and higher standards of living, they required imports of commodities, and that has continued. It's true for China now. It's been true for Japan. It's true of all the European economies. America's a bit of an exception, like Canada and Australia, because it's so resource abundant. Now, there's a secondary issue, which is the broader issue of supply chains in industrial commodities. And that form of integration became deeper during this more recent period of globalization, though it started again in the period immediately after the Second World War. We've been integrating with Europe and America for a much longer time. And of course, if you import things, you're potentially vulnerable to disruption. But as I've also experienced in my lifetime, you can also be vulnerable to disruption if you depend on domestic supplies. Probably the most severe shortage of essential commodities in my lifetime so far were the result of the coal strikes in the 70s and 80s. And these were purely domestic. it is in the nature of the division of economic labor that one is vulnerable to disruptions in supply chains. And the globalization process is certainly one of the factors in increasing that vulnerability. But I would stress what we're seeing now with oil, we saw in the 70s with the oil embargo, that's 50 years ago. And in fact, it was much more threatening then because we were more oil dependent then than we are now.
Yeah, so
you have not entered any numbers. Please re-enter.
Do you think that this oil crisis at the moment is any big push, will give any big push to the climate change movement, you know, from shifting to the reliance on gas to actually solar or green energy? Do you think that would happen, really?
I think there's a lot of movement in that direction. As I said, there was a period when Britain had, in particular, because of the North Sea, was producing a lot of oil and gas. So that gave it a certain degree of self-sufficiency. That's now gone as the reserves have been effectively exhausted. And that was rather an exceptional position and not the case for most of the larger European countries. The French have achieved substantial self-sufficiency in electricity by going nuclear. Nobody else did that in Europe to the same degree. Indeed, no other country in the Western world has done that to the same degree. So that if you want to be more self-sufficient in energy nowadays, and you don't have the possibilities that the US has to produce it domestically because of shale oil and gas and other domestic resources, then you have to go for renewables or nuclear. And there's no desire to go for nuclear, and it will probably take far too long and to be too costly. So this is a very good reason for investing more in renewables. Wind and sun, to the extent that they shine, as the wind blows and the sun shines, are there, and you can exploit them. Now, how far it will be possible for our countries to become reliant upon renewables in the near future is, I think, very much open to debate. There are huge technical problems in turning intermittent sources of energy into permanently available sources of energy. Pretty obvious that it doesn't work when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. So you need massive storage arrangements of some kind. There are many possibilities. So it's technically really quite difficult, but there's no to become fully self-sufficient. But it is clearly the direction in which we're all going to go. And there's a large amount of investment that is likely, particularly in Europe, in renewables, which will at the very least reduce reliance on imported fuels. I should stress that there are some uses of gas in particular, also oil, in the petrochemicals industry, which are going to be more difficult to replace and certainly can't be replaced by wind or solar directly. You have to generate a very different sort of economy, probably around hydrogen. And that's another big set of investments and technical problems.
So you mentioned France just recently. So we are going to have the elections just 3 days away. We have a strong candidate, Le Pen, actually, and she has this anti-globalist and anti-European Union sort of agenda. Had it in the past, but now she's managed to cover it up with the cost of living crisis and some of the small matters. So what do you think about the near term for the France? What holds for the France elections? Do you think that she would be able to sort of edge out Macron in the elections, or do you think otherwise? And what would the implications be if she won for the European Union and the global economy?
Well, those are certainly good questions. I'm not going to predict the outcome of the elections because I'm not a political pundit. What I notice is that the recent polls are apparently moving somewhat towards Monsieur Macron. So the chances that he will be re-elected have increased from the basis of the polls. And I'm inclined to believe, but given the surprises we've had in the last 10 years, I would not say any more than I'm inclined to believe that Emmanuel Macron will be re-elected, though by a smaller majority than he got last time, when it was sort of 63-37. It looks to be a smaller majority. So it's very clear that the right-wing candidate, Marine Le Pen, is gaining popularity in France, which is itself very, very important. And that suggests this process is not over by any means. Then the next question is just assume for a moment, even if it's a little unlikely or possibly very unlikely, that she were to get elected. And then the question obviously is, how would she behave in government? And that's really unpredictable. She's never been in government. She's has no governmental experience. It's not at all clear that she would have a working majority in parliament, in the French parliament. Indeed, it's rather unlikely that she would. So she would have the powers of the presidency, but she wouldn't actually can be able to legislate easily. But she can, under the French constitution, do quite a lot by decree. Now, the question is, what would she then do with this? Would she really go all out with her agenda or not? At the moment, what one has to say about her agenda is that it's intellectually completely incoherent. She wants to increase spending and lower taxes. And she's talking about increasing spending in a country which now has the highest ratio of spending to GDP in the world. So it would push it almost certainly, the spending ratio to GDP above 60%. If she cut taxes as well, as she's promised, to help with the cost of living, the French fiscal deficit would explode. And that would almost certainly create some serious problems in the debt markets. And similar to what happened in 1980 with Monsieur Mitterrand, who ran into a financial crisis very quickly, but in this case, inside the Eurozone. So it would create a Eurozone financial crisis. Nobody knows how the European Central Bank would respond, but I think given her policies, they might well not help her. She might then feel obliged to try and leave the euro and recreate the French franc. That would create a monstrous financial crisis. I mean, truly monstrous, and nobody knows how that will play out. But she might be forced into going for a new currency and exchange controls and default on her debt. Meanwhile, she has a social agenda, which includes banning Islamic dress for women and some unknown policies to reestablish what she thinks of as French values and norms, potentially immensely divisive effects. She wants to pull out of NATO, which will immediately raise questions about the alliance in Europe. This will certainly destabilize all of this, the relations with Germany, in the most profound way. And France and Germany are the core of the European project. And nobody knows how the Germans will respond. And we can assume that Mr. Putin will be ecstatic. But the simple truth is, we have no idea what she will actually do. I suspect she has no idea what she will actually do. But and nobody knows how radical she will end up being, whether she will stick with just, using policies which demonstrate, which are sort of performance of radicalism, or whether she will really be serious. So it will be somewhere between a pretty serious destabilization and a massive crisis. And I think at this stage, all we can say is we don't know which it will be.
Yeah, like just like Boris, like a whole range. So we have a like a whole range of historical figures, like Penn and Oliver Cromwell, Nazism. So Boris Johnson, they all have been rather both left and right. So moving on to the domestic economy, the British economy. So we have seen the Brexit actually took place in 2016, which is now a long time ago. Feeling 55% Brexit and 45% Remain. One of our audience members ought to vote Brexit, and it did so. But he wanted a soft, intelligent Brexit, for example, to protect the UK, UK's financial industry, services industry, to remain within the ECJ. But he questions, what does he do in the face of a hard, ideologically driven Brexit, which in his view will be most damaging to the British economy?
Just one small correction to what you said. The vote was more or less 52 to 48, not 55 to 45. So it was pretty close. My own view at the time was that, given, obviously, there's no question, we at the paper, and I in particular, were opposed to Brexit. I thought it was very foolish, and the arguments put forward for it were very, very poor. And most of them misunderstood the EU and our relationship with it. But I always felt that once we'd voted for Brexit, it would be very difficult to get a soft Brexit. In particular, the Brexiters had made pretty clear that they desired to remove any control over British policy by the ECJ. That was sort of symbolic of our loss of sovereignty from their point of view. And they also indicated very, very clearly, it was clearly a central part of their popular, or if I may say, populist campaign, that they wanted to get control over immigration, substantial control over immigration. And if we wanted to leave the ECJ and we wanted to leave to get control of immigration, we could not remain in the single market. It was quite clear we could not remain in the single market. And that meant that we had only two fallback positions in terms of our economic relation. One would be to remain in the customs union, and the other was to go for a free trade area of some kind. And Mrs. May, who recognized the balance of power in her party pretty early, decided to go for the customs union and rejected, essentially ruled out with her very first major speech, the EEA, the single market option, the European Economic Area option. And so we were right at the beginning going for a relatively hard Brexit, one that would take us out of the single market. Now, none of that was really surprising. She then tried to put together a customs union deal, which would have the advantage that it would avoid a border. If we're in the customs union, it would avoid an inspected border in Ireland, which soon became an important issue, and it would preserve much, if not all, certainly not all, but much of the advantages of being in close relation with the EU for our trade in goods, though it would not be of any use for trade in services because they aren't affected by the customs. A customs union is basically about goods, but it would avoid rules of origin and would make, therefore, procedures easier than going to a free trade area, which involves more inspection. It would not avoid regulatory inspection. It would still create lots of barriers, but it would have been less. This option, the customs union option, was defeated by the House. And it was in the context of that defeat, with both Tory rebels and Labour's support. They were both opposed it. And of course, Liberal Dems, there weren't many by then. So that collapsed. And Boris saw his opportunity to go for a hard Brexit, the hardest possible Brexit, which is one without the customs union, without the single market. And then he had, of course, the ultimate swindle. He reached an agreement which everybody could see in order to get any possibility of a free trade agreement. So essentially to get a withdrawal agreement, which was going to be a necessary basis for any comity with the EU afterwards, including a free trade area. He signed the Northern Ireland Protocol, which meant that we were going to put a barrier in the Irish Sea. It was, again, perfectly obvious that would happen. And of course, he's lied about it ever since, which is not in the least surprising. So that's what he does. So we've ended up where we are, not as a surprise. It's not in the least a surprise. It was perfectly obvious to anyone who knew very much about this, and unfortunately I do, because trade has been a major part of my life, and I've been around through all the negotiations involved in this, that once we agreed to leave, the soft Brexit option was essentially an empty option. They promised in the campaign, you can go back and look on the website, or unless they've taken it down, that that we will continue to have the easiest possible trade relationships and all the rest of it, but all that was either self-delusion, possible, because most of them knew nothing about the EU and the trade arrangements. They were just completely ignorant, or that it was a fraud. I don't know which it was, but the result is where we ended up was not in the least surprising. And it's pretty close, not absolutely, because we've got some sort of free trade agreement, to the most damaging Brexit we could have. And it's had consequences for our trade, which are more or less in line with that.
Brilliant. So moving on to the local economy now, from British to Coventry. So Coventry was initially known as the UK's modern city. I'm not sure if it's still known, but we had the gradual significant fall of the UK motor industry in the 1970s.
So, UK what? Motor industry?
Motor industry, yeah. So the question is, what was the last point at which you think the British volume car industry could have been saved, and how?
Well, that's a wonderful question. If you mean by the British volume car industry, the British owned volume car industry, this is a very important distinction, because obviously there was an expansion of British motor vehicle production from its nadir in the 80s and 90s, but that was entirely because of foreign manufacturers, particularly the Japanese and BMW, I suppose. But if you mean the British-owned manufacturing, volume manufacturing industry, I think that the answer probably is sometime in the 1950s or 1960s. Somebody hasn't got their mute button on, and so I'm getting my voice back, so perhaps everybody could put their mute button on. So the problem was, after the Second World War, the British motor car industry, like that of the rest of Europe, existed behind protective barriers, and we had a protected market in the in the Commonwealth and Empire. That was increasingly lost as the countries concerned became independent and started to pursue their own policies, and so imperial preference disappeared. And so those favored markets disappeared. But because we didn't join the EU, we had customs barriers against us in the European market. throughout the 50s and 60s, while at that time the European market was integrating very rapidly into with the customs union, essentially no trade barriers, and we were outside that. In addition to that, we inherited from the interwar period some really terrible labor relations, which were never resolved. So the combination of having essentially a relatively protected industry, which was oriented to the domestic market, but not really internationally competitive, with terrible labor relations, made the British industry increasingly uncompetitive globally, particularly against the Germans and later the Japanese. And and when the trade barriers finally came down, we joined the common market in the 70s. We had, in addition, of course, the global recession, but that was less important. The British Leyland Motor Cars, I think it was called by that time because of the merger in the 60s of the two major domestic producers, or the major domestic producers, was in a truly terrible state. And I suspect it was by then too late to resuscitate it, to be able to compete with far more successful and competitive European and Japanese producers. In any case, I think the game was over by 1980 for British mass market manufacturing. Less true for high-end producers, where there remained some significant possibility, businesses like Jaguar and Rover. Rover, of course, swallowed up in this disaster. So I think this was a very old series of mistakes. And once competition became increasingly global, the residual British-owned motor vehicle manufacturing was just too weak to survive. Rover was just too weak to survive as a genuinely competitive firm. Now, would it have been different if we poured vastly more money into it from the government? We can't replay economic history. I must say I'm pretty skeptical, but possibly.
But then just after a few years, we had the scandal, the Phoenix 4, where they bought the Rover from BMW for just £10. And how can companies be protected against such actions by the Phoenix 4, the car case of the British Leyland?
Well, the sale to Phoenix 4, I mean, this was obviously a classic asset stripping deal. I assume, I mean, to my mind, what had happened by then was that the residual business, the mass market business, was, for reasons I've discussed very cursorily, not a globally competitive business, and BMW failed to make it so. It kept the bit that it liked, Mini, and Land Rover, if I remember correctly. But it just wanted to get rid of the rest. And the asset strippers saw an opportunity to strip assets, but it was a dead business. I mean, it was a dead business. Now, I think the profits could have gone to the people at large, but by then, it seems to me, after the long history of failure of the British ownership of this company, and then the failure of BMW to turn it round, it was no longer possible to save it. Again, it comes down to the question. By then, we were members of the EU, so a state buyout with a limitless state funding to rescue it would have been certainly against EU rules, and I think it was far, far too late to save the business by then. But it was pretty obvious that the Phoenix 4 were going to achieve absolutely nothing in industrial terms. They were just going to strip whatever they could out of the business.
Yeah, so this brings us to the next question. Has the acquisition by overseas companies of so much of UK industry and commerce been unbalanced, beneficial to the people of the UK? And if not, does the whole neoliberal project stand condemned?
I think the I mean, my own feeling is that, and there's a very long-standing analysis of this, we've had large-scale foreign investment in this country, actually goes back to the 20s, and the evidence that I'm aware of has been pretty consistent that on balance, the foreign managed companies have been substantially better managed and more successful than the domestically managed companies. And many of them, of course, have been here forever. I mean, think of Ford, it's been here for 100 years. GM ditto, General Motors. The Japanese, of course, were here very successfully and happily until we left the EU. So my own view is that in our case, the record seems to me that foreign ownership of British productive assets, either through greenfield investment, of which there was plenty, or through the purchase of businesses, has on the whole, improved business. There's and the way it's performed, and I think it's rectified, or at least partially rectified, the most obvious weakness of the British economy over a century, which is very poor management, relatively poor management. It's sad to say this, but that seems to me the evidence. Now, there's an interesting question whether a long-standing question about whether the role of the financial sector in British manufacturing has been desirable. Has the city played a good role? That's a question that was already being raised in the 1920s by, of all people, the Winston Churchill. And he argued, and I think correctly, that going back for a very long time, even before the First World War, that the city, which was then predominantly British, of course, has always been oriented towards global finance rather than the finance of British industry, largely because Britain is a relatively small economy. And if you can do global finance, the opportunities are far greater. So we have a long-standing problem because of the disconnect between our dominant financial sector, whether it's predominantly domestically owned and run, or as now has huge foreign involvement, whether our financial sector has a positive interaction with our industrial sector. And I think the answer to that is it really doesn't. And that's a very long-standing problem. But you can't do much about it as long as we have such a globally significant financial entrepot in London, and our economy is relatively small. That's the financial sector issue. And the final issue is, do we allow takeovers by foreigners, or indeed by anybody, of our companies too easily? Would it be better to, as many other countries do, to defend existing companies and their managers from takeovers? So this is not an argument about greenfield investment, but from takeovers. I'm inclined now to think there might be an argument for making it somewhat more difficult, or at least allowing companies to protect themselves against takeovers more than at present they do in Britain. The Americans have plenty of takeover defenses. Whether that would have made a really valuable contribution to the health of British-owned manufacturing as a whole, I really doubt it. For the sort of, if you look at most of the engineering and other businesses that have disappeared, they were just dreadfully managed under their domestic bosses, and had been when so many of them collapsed in the 80s. Bad macroeconomic policy made it worse, but I think blaming this all on foreigners is a profound mistake. These are rooted in really deep domestic failures.
Brilliant. So we are going to open the. So that was just a final question before we can open the the forum to the audience for questions. What do you think is the status of developing economies prospectively? Because we always talk about developed economies in the Western world, but what do you think about the current status? What's the future for developing economies in Africa and Asia in general?
Well, I think it's very difficult, really difficult to summarize. I mean, the developed countries have, if you're very generous in your definition, about 15% of the world's population. So by a process of elimination, emerging and developing countries are 85% of the world, right? So now, of course, in that, I'm including China, which is technically still a developing country in terms of poverty. Obviously, we're including India, but that's 85% of the world. And it's not very surprising. These places are radically different from one another. I mean, immensely different from one another in terms of their levels of development, their opportunities for development, and so forth. My general summary, and this is ludicrously abbreviated, is that East and South Asia contain half of the world's population. So that's East Asia, you know what we're talking about. That includes Southeast Asia. And in general, though one would have to make lots of exceptions, these economies have done extremely well relative to all other economies in the last 30 or 40 years and have developed relatively successfully. Now, it's not true to the same extent everywhere, far from it. Obviously, Northeast Asia has done much better than anybody else, including China here. But East and South Asia has been a relative success. India has had good positive growth. Bangladesh has been a remarkable success, much more than anybody imagined half a century ago. Pakistan is a bit of a more mixed story, but largely because of politics. Indonesia has achieved quite a lot. All the ASEAN countries have done really pretty well, and China has been a spectacular success. So that's half the world's population, and they're now, by now, these East and South Asia together really properly measure the biggest part of the world economy. Africa has been, on the whole, much less successful, and so has South America. Their problems are very, very different, but the core of both is that they have neither has been really successful in industrialization. And in my view, industrialization remains the kernel, the core of a successful development process. One needs rapid industrialization to move from an agricultural, agrarian society to a high-income, service-dominated society like ours. And a lot of countries have failed with their industrialization process. There's one country, India, which has achieved a lot of growth through services. I think it's always been a bit vulnerable for that reason. But anyway, to summarize, I would say East and South Asia have done pretty well, not perfect, very far from it. Africa and South America, which are still predominantly commodity-oriented economies, lots of exceptions, have done substantially less well. And I expect that will, alas, continue to be the case for some time.
Yeah, one problem in Africa, actually, African economies, is that they frequently experience droughts and, famines. So what do you think? How do you think that the world in general should manage scarce resources like water supplies, in the event of climate change and drying up springs and stuff like that?
Famines have been serious, but Amartya Sen famously argued 60 years ago that most famines are political events rather than genuine shortage events. And I think that's been true of the major famines in Africa, even in the last 40 years. There was a very famous famine in Ethiopia in the 80s and maybe returning, and that's pretty clearly political more than because there was actually a severe shortage of food. The huge commodity price spikes, and particularly food price spikes, which are a consequence of the war at least partly a consequence of the war between Russia and Ukraine, are going to create very big problems. And we're going to have to provide, I think, quite a lot of food aid. That hasn't been essential for a long time. And it's not clear how that's going to work, because we don't have the food surpluses we used to have, particularly Americans don't, that we used to have, and nor do the Europeans. They've eliminated them. So there could well be some significant shortage problems. And with higher prices, there are quite likely to be a lot of people who won't afford food. And that's going to be a very big challenge for the world in the next year or two. But I would assume that that it will be possible, once things normalize, which may be difficult, for this food problem to be resolved. I'm not trying to belittle it. You mentioned water. Water, of course, is the supreme non-tradable. It's really hard to trade water because one needs so much, and it's and for people to be able to drink it, you have to be able to transport it very cheaply. So essentially, water is relatively local, and there are, of course, significant cross-border problems because, particularly because of river systems cross national borders, and you can get really big problems if the upstream countries start damming the water supply. And that's the sort of problem you get with water. There are lots of other problems you get with water to do with better water use and management, which is in general very, very bad around the world. But water is not a trade problem in the standard sense. Water is a local supply and management problem, and an income distribution problem too, but it's essentially a local supply and management problem. What you need is much better infrastructure, much more effective systems for distributing and pricing water, and cross-border cooperation where river systems cross borders, as in the Middle East, as in Africa, as in Southeast Asia. That's a really big issue.
So, past famines have been political, as you said, but the Irish potato blight was Europe-wide and maybe could not have been wholly ameliorated. But if water is less abundant, then will the future not be different and worse?
Well, the potato blight could not have been ameliorated since nobody knew how to stop it. But of course, food could have been distributed from the United Kingdom, the rest of the United Kingdom, to Ireland. And that was... that's local. It could have been done. It wasn't organized effectively, and that was a major scandal. Comparable and worse cases were the failure to deal with the Bengal famine during the Second World War, which was again perfectly feasible as far as I can see, and the British rulers at the time failed to deal with it. Now, nobody knows, I think, quite how global warming will interact with water supply. It's going to be very, very complicated. In some areas, water precipitation could increase substantially. Because of the heat, there's going to be more water vapor and probably more circulation of water. That could, of course, be devastating with floods and landslides and all the rest of it. That's where you get into really massive infrastructure investment requirements to manage water. Other parts of the world could quite likely see desertification, the expansion of deserts. That could be a very, very significant threat, particularly if the Great Desert Belt close to the equator expands significantly. That could, of course, have dramatic effects. And obviously, it's conceivable, and I'm not enough. I mean, these are areas I have no expertise in. I'm just commenting on what I read, that it could disrupt core weather patterns like monsoons, and then who the hell knows where we end up. So the big point is the impact of global warming on local water supplies, how much water there is I think one of those huge questions. Part of it can be dealt with, as I said, by investment. Similarly, we may have to move cities if we don't manage this, because the sea level will rise. In fact, it's quite clear it will rise. That will again require massive investment. But if there's desertification and we can't deal with that, then people are going to have to move. And in our current world, mass movement of vast numbers of people is more or less impossible to manage. So all one can say is the question you raise gets to the heart of what the process of global warming is going to mean. And since I believe that, unfortunately, there is going to be substantial global warming, we are likely to face many, many very serious crises over the next 30, 40 years, perhaps sooner. And the availability of water, too much in some places, too little in other places, and the management of that is clearly going to be a central challenge.
Brilliant. So we have one more question from the audience, actually a student. So the question is, with the deglobalization apparently perhaps will be taking place in the next few years, what do you see as a future of education in terms of university studies, because the UK or the Britain is heavily reliant on international students? So what's the future in your perspective?
That's a fascinating question. My wife is an expert on this and is involved in university policy quite extensively, so she has much more knowledge than I do. We really don't know, we cannot know how this process and how far this process of deglobalization will go. There are two dimensions of this. There are many dimensions, but there are two dimensions at least. First of all, globalization, as this question already indicates, has many different facets. So there's globalization of trade in goods. We talked about that with supply chains. Here we're talking about the globalization of people, the movement of people, as students, as temporary workers, as long-term migrants, maybe as refugees. So the movement of people raises huge questions in the context of globalization, and it's never been fully liberalized. We've never globalized, obviously, the movement of people. The last time that the movement of people was relatively free was the late 19th century, and even then it wasn't really. Then we have services, particularly internet-enabled services. They're very difficult to stop from moving. The Chinese have a massive effort to control the movement of information associated with service trade and other things. But that's pretty free, very difficult to stop. And then there's the pure movement of ideas, again, internet enabled. And these are all different, and they have to be managed in different ways. And some of them just can't be stopped. So a full deglobalization is impossible. We have created technology which make full deglobalization impossible. However, second point, I've made that, I stress that. How far people will try to go in stopping it is unclear. That depends on politics on both sides. But obviously, in my third and last point, in some way, the easiest thing to stop, it's not quite the easiest, but one of these is people. People are physical. They can't be moved virtually. If they want to be students in Britain, we can do some things by virtual teaching, online teaching, but it's not the same thing. We can do some things by moving university campuses to other countries. And there are some university campuses run by British universities in China, for example. But that's a limit to how much you can do of that. You have to move faculty and so forth. And again, the problems of politics intervene. And finally, you have to move the students. Well, obviously, if relations between Britain and China, to take an obvious example, get so bad that the British decide they don't want to risk having lots and lots of Chinese students, or more likely, the Chinese decide they don't want Chinese young people to be exposed to bad Western ideas, then this will stop. And the result for the British university system is quite clear. It would have to contract dramatically. Now, there would be an effort to replace those students with students from other countries, perhaps India, where we would be having different relations. But that just underlines the immense unpredictability of the world we're now moving into. But I would stress my conclusion. I don't believe it's likely. Anything is possible. But I don't think it's likely that we will have full deglobalization, and some parts of deglobalization, a full breakdown, a division of the internet into local or regional internets with no interaction between the different parts, I think is really difficult and unlikely. It's just going to be a mess. And the nature of messes is that the way they work is unpredictable.
Brilliant. So just one final question from the audience. What are your thoughts on cryptocurrency, given that Russia recently tried to use it as a way to avoid sanctions from the US and whatnot?
Cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on cryptocurrencies, but I'm pretty sure they can't be used as a way around the sanctions. The problem at the moment is that none of the cryptocurrencies, certainly not Bitcoin, permit even a tiny part of the volume of transactions that are actually required to make the global economy work. So you can have Bitcoin, say, as a store of value, rather like gold. You know, I think of Bitcoin as a sort of virtual gold. But if you want to buy anything with gold, right, you have to sell it for currency, because you have to buy things in any large quantity with bank accounts. There's no other way to do it. If you're a Russian firm and you want to buy, say, vast numbers of semiconductors that are important for your military, and you want to get these semiconductors from Taiwan, I'm just giving an example because they're the biggest producers, you have to give the Taiwanese money they want, and that's dollars or maybe euros. And that means even if you've got Bitcoin, you've got to sell them for dollars. And you can't do that because the financial system that operates in dollars is under control of the US. So the only way to avoid this problem is not to use a cryptocurrency as on the basis of the technologies we now have. You have to make your currency an international reserve currency, namely one that everybody wants to hold, which means that your financial system must be internationally open and operate like the financial systems of Western countries. But the problem is that the Russians and the Chinese, or the Indians for that matter, don't want to do it because they would lose control over their financial system. And in the short run, they can't do it. So I think cryptocurrencies as a way round sanctions for the foreseeable future is a complete irrelevance. They can do barter trade with each other, and they can operate, say, Russia and China can operate together in RMB, but that limits them essentially to buy things from each other and not to things from the whole world. And that's not yet enough for them.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So that was the last question for today. Really enjoyed this discussion. I was not able to introduce it really well at the start. So for those audience members who are not aware of Martin Wolf, he's one of the best journalists in the world and was awarded the CB in 2000. And I highly cherish his insights, as many other people, when he especially writes a column in the Financial Times. So for those who enjoyed the discussion, I would recommend that you go to Financial Times, read Martin's brilliant post articles and whatnot on a magazine, and I hope you enjoyed it today. I really believe that you did. Thanks, Martin Wolf. Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf. It was a pleasure having you here today, and hopefully see you soon in the future.
It was a great pleasure, and I wish you all great success in your futures. and I hope they will be